Okay, today's exercise has been titled How to Build Thicker Arguments. What we mean by this is how to develop arguments more thoroughly and to make them more analytically rigorous rather than making them physically broader, which as a concept is very difficult to do. So I'm sure that many of you have had judges say to you after rounds, you should have done more analysis. A lot of times, it happened to me when I started, and what more analysis means was always a very nebulous concept to me. And so this session is about how to do more analysis. You'll notice that a lot of it involves saying some very simple things just as part of your argument, but it's often true that very simple claims form an important part of an argument, even when they're sort of trivially true. But there's still things that are worth saying, because they still form a part of that argument and they still build into this. So what I'm mostly going to focus on is actually working through a few examples, because it's actually far easier to do in the specific than in the abstract. Before I get to that, we'll discuss roughly some of the tricks I use to think about arguments. Okay, so if we take an argument, but one individual argument, that we're going to work with the arguments in a moment from the motion. Well, why don't I write the motion up for you? We're going to work from the motion this House would legalise all drugs. It's a nice simple motion, and we're going to work with one specific argument from that. So we're going to work from proposition. Sorry, you spelled the English way. Okay, so we're going to work from the proposition argument that this is going to minimise adverse consequences of drug taking. And so we're going to work out how we make that argument as thoroughly analysed as possible and as impactful as possible. And there are multiple ways to do this. So the way in which I start by analysing most of my claims is by working out whether or not it's true. So obviously we're going to have to demonstrate that our argument is true before we get anywhere to explain why it's important in the round. So in order to work out if it is true, I tend to sort of ask myself multiple times in my argumentative chain, is this bit of it true? Is this bit of it true? And if I can ever give a simple justification for why that part of the argument is true, I think it's worth giving it. I think it's worth saying, like, your own internal answer to why it's true. You can also do this for analysis that you do on your feet. It's often true that you don't really have a huge amount of time to write out your argument. You can only write out little parts of it. And so if just while you're on your feet, you just get yourself to justify every statement until you get to something really trivial. Gravity, probably not going to get quite if gravity exists. Or like, I don't know, needles without other people's blood on them are healthier for you. There's probably going to be a point where you can stop there. I don't think anybody's going to stand up and go, I think you'll find that actually that's healthier, because, yeah, they'll be mad. So get to the point where you're at a place which is basically logically unchallengeable, and then you can consider that part of the argument to be rigorously explained. The other thing you need to ask yourself, when you've got to the end of why is this true, is why is this important, why does it matter? The other thing you might hear judges say a lot is you didn't have a lot of impact on the round. And I often make reference to arguments being impacted in the debate, how effectively they're impacted. Essentially what I mean by this is the importance of the consequences you demonstrate. So if you say, this leads to lower health risks of taking drugs, sure, I can see how that could be important, but I think it's better if you explain why it's important. If you say, okay, so why does this matter so much? Why is this something that we should focus on? And it may be that there's a specific problem it addresses, say, like, this is something we should focus on because rates of drug taking are very high, deaths from drug overdoses are very high, or something like this. Or that it's very important as a right. So if you say, if it was a different debate that was about free speech, and you say, okay, this harms free speech, why does it harm free speech? It stops people from saying these things. Then you need to get to why is it important, because that's where the focus on that argument is. So, why is this true? Why is this important? Before we move on, it's worth saying that sometimes there's going to be different emphases on these different points. Sometimes things are trivially true, like banning certain types of speech is obviously going to be a limit on freedom of speech. You don't really need to explain that very much. And sometimes things are trivially important. Sometimes you're arguing that this is going to lead to, if you were talking about the invasion of Syria and you said on op that this is going to lead to many people dying for these following reasons, and you don't really need to explain why that's important. It's trivially important. It's very obvious that large numbers of people dying matters. But different things have different emphases, so you'll need to justify different things. So if you're talking about the restriction on freedom of speech, you need to justify its importance. If you're talking about the deaths, you need to justify their truth, because that's where the emphasis in that argument lies, and that's what you need to demonstrate. Another thing is that it's often very helpful to be very clear about the purpose of each argument. This is especially true in summary speeches and possibly deputy speeches in the top half, depending on how much your deputy refers to your partner. often judges get a little bit lost in the analysis, and like you get a little bit lost in the analysis as well. And you get so bogged down in the detail of your points that you forget to come back to the overarching theme, what you're trying to prove here. And so it can be very useful to start each point with the sentence that sums up that point. There's often something that, like, right at the centre of your argument which you need to be true in order for this to stand, and you need to be important for this to stand. That really encapsulates the idea. So you can say at the start of your points, this argument will demonstrate to you that something. And that will be contextually different in every round, of course. It might be that this argument will contextually demonstrate the other side's wrong. It might be that it will contextually demonstrate that this is the most important argument. But you want to get it right at the start just so everybody can see where you're going. And you probably want to put it at the end of your point as well, just so people are reminded of why you were saying this. Sometimes in debates it's not very clear why you're saying some things, especially to me as a judge. I often sit down and I'm listening to people talk and I'm thinking, why are you saying this? It's all very interesting, but why? And it's very helpful if a judge can provide that explanation, and a speaker can provide that explanation and say, look, this is what this proves, this is why it matters to our case. The other thing is, often you have multiple reasons for something being true. So you might say, like, this minimises the health consequences of drug taking, for various reasons. You often want to say the number at the start. You can say, for 4 reasons, firstly, and then you can go through each of them in order. What that does for you is it helps you separate out the reasons in your mind. I think this is very useful because it means that essentially a lot of prep doesn't become very abstract about how can I make this argument better. It becomes about how can I add to this list of very specific things. So we'll come to it in a minute. We'll be making essentially lists of more and more detailed claims. But when you're thinking about it like that, it's then very easy to use your partner and to sort of add to it, because you can say, okay, so we're trying to demonstrate that we're minimising the health consequences of drug taking. I've got dirty needles, what have you got? And they can then add to that. And like, it's a very easy cooperative effort, where it's much harder to just go, what arguments can you think of? Or how can we just keep talking in this debate? So when you break things down like that, development becomes much easier, and also it's far easier for people's note-taking too. So there's really not an awful lot more you can say about this than practice it, so we'll get on with doing some practice. Okay, so this has to legalise all drugs. Let's take the prop argument about minimising adverse consequences of drug taking. People happy with shorthand? Sorry, I'm left-handed, so this is going to be annoying. If you want to have a little think about this argument so that you can chip in. Okay, so do people understand what the argument is we're making here? Sorry, that's a negative side. So, in the debate, this House will legalise all drugs. We've decided that our first argument is going to be, on prop, that this is going to minimise the adverse consequences of taking drugs. So, broadly, what do people think are the adverse consequences of taking drugs? Go on then.
Their health consequences.
Okay, so their health consequences of various types? Okay, can anyone think of another sort of category of consequences of drug taking?
Criminality.
Criminality, okay.
Cost.
Cost, sure.
Addiction.
Health?
Probably.
Cool. Any others?
The environment, like the illegal environment that's used in.
Okay. One second, I'm going to write these down so we can discuss them. So we've got cost, health, criminality, environment.
The quality.
The
quality.
quality.
I mean the quality of the drugs.
Quality of the drugs. In that they might not be good enough, or that.
They're cut with other drugs.
Okay, sure. So do you think that fits under any of our pre-existing categories? Which I haven't written up. So, like, probably a health consequence, right? So, why don't we look at health? So we seem to have a few ideas in here. Okay. So let's talk about minimising the health consequences of adverse drug taking. Can you read my handwriting? I've never been able to write properly. We should have tools at some stage. Okay, so we've had a few ideas about health consequences of drugs. So one was about purity, right? So, drug purity. Okay, so that's one of the health consequences that we're going to minimise. And so once we've got to this stage, we've explained how we can minimise the health consequences of drugs being cut with rat poison by legalising all drugs. So how do you think that would work? How would you explain that?
So it'd be regulated now.
Sure, okay, so we could have a regulation system in place. Yeah, cool. Any other sort of prop mechanism we could use to make sure that the drugs are all safe?
Just like labeling and stuff.
Sure, labelling would I imagine would be part of regulation. So we can put in here something like ability to regulate. Okay, can we think of any other ways that our model might deal with this issue? So is this going to depend to a certain extent on how we set this debate up, right? There are multiple ways you can set up a legalise all drugs debate. The way in which I would always do it is to have government supply entirely. And so the government produce and sell all the drugs, basically. And so then, rather than just saying that they can regulate it, they actually make them. So we can say ability to regulate or produce. So like that, it's reasonably clear then how we deal with the purity issue, right? So, one of the health consequences, purity. We can regulate it, we can produce it. What were the other health consequences we had? What was your one, Alex?
Addiction, but again, fell under health.
Addiction, yeah, great. Let's have more health things. This is how we develop our arguments. Okay, cool, addiction. Okay, so how can we deal with addiction by legalising all drugs? Anyone else? Yeah.
You won't be scared to go into clinic to treat yourself.
Cool, great.
Because now you're afraid of it.
Yep. Okay, so why are we afraid of it now?
Because it is illegal and you can be punished by something.
Absolutely, yeah. Great example of making a very simple claim, but I think it's a claim that you should make. You should say you're less afraid of rehab. Why? Because currently it's illegal. There are significant legal consequences potentially of you going to rehab, and there are chances that if you do go, you could face criminal sanctions. However, if you legalise drugs, there's less of that fear, and you're more likely to be able to go. Can we think of any other reasons we might be more willing to go to rehab?
Less stigma.
Less stigma, great. So why do you think that's true?
Because if drugs are legal, there's not going to be this whole stigma that drugs are bad, and like that if you have a drug problem, that like it's a completely negative thing. It'll probably be a little bit more acceptable.
Okay, great. So when we think about how it's more acceptable, how that changes social stigma, a very useful thing when you're discussing arguments that change things, like a certain social stigma, is giving a narrative of how that change would work. So, well, not necessarily how it would work, but what it would change into. So, if you can say how that's... So what we say is it starts as, it generally is a stigma because it's considered illegal behaviour. What would that stigma change to once drugs are all legal, do we think?
Be on par with alcohol.
Be on par with alcohol, sure. And so how generally is something like alcohol dependency treated?
It's like normal.
Yeah, to a certain extent like normal, but certainly like a normal sort of medical condition, essentially. And I think that's what you want to get across with this idea. You want to say, okay, so there'll be less stigma because it won't be seen as like some illegal, illicit activity, but it will be seen as like a legitimate medical concern. And so people are more likely to seek rehab because they now understand it better as a medical concern. And so now you can see how we've dealt with that changing stigma. We've shown what it changes from and what it changes to. And I think the comparison with alcohol is very useful for making that persuasively quite powerful, because it gives something for an audience or a judge to latch onto and say, okay, I can see how that would be plausible, I can see how it works in other situations. Okay, so can we think of any other health consequences that we minimise from taking drugs?
Drugs as a treatment to other diseases? Or
No, I generally mean illegal drugs.
medical marijuana, for instance.
Okay, sure. I don't know if there's a huge amount we can do with medical marijuana. How do you think you'd make that argument?
Well, a lot of people with panic attacks or post-traumatic stress disorder could be treated with medical marijuana better than they can be treated with like Xanax or any of the other antidepressants they're currently taking.
Okay. I mean, I think in order to make that argument as impactful as possible, we need to show that there was a significant shortage in the way in which these things were treated, which may be possible. I'm not going to put it down because I don't know how to make that argument, but I think it might be something you can work on. Any others?
transmitted because there would be better access to needles.
Okay, great. So access to needles. Access to clean needles. More important. Okay, so why do we think that's going to happen? Why do you think people are going to get access to clean needles?
Well, because the government can supply them.
Great, government can supply. Anything else? No?
So like, even though like in some states, or like you're talking about, there are clean needle programs, but people might not want to go to them because they're afraid that if people see them going to these like clean needle things, they like won't.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
The same stigma argument that we used earlier. Often arguments have multiple applications in a round. It's more often two pieces of rebuttal, which often have like huge numbers of applications in a round. But because we've already explained what the stigma means here, we can just make a reference back to it here. We can say also, I think people are more likely to seek treatments from clean needles. We think there's going to be less stigma on it, as I explained earlier. And just like that, you've brought in all that analysis for the same points, but you don't need to re-explain it in any way. All you need to say is just set it up. Any other health benefits that we can think of that are clear?
There's probably less users in general. There will be probably some control that not everyone will be able to purchase those drugs.
Okay, so you think there'll be less users overall?
Yeah.
Why?
Because like in alcohol, if you're not 18 you cannot buy alcohol, and probably it will be the same with drugs.
Okay, cool. So probably in the model we'll put an age limit on it. I think that's certainly something that we consider doing. How can we show that that age limit is going to decrease drug taking? Because presumably if people were taking them illegally before, they'll continue to take them illegally. Or absent other argumentation. Sorry, start over here and then we go there.
If the government's now the marketplace for it, it kind of weeds out some of those illegal, I'm sorry for that phrase, it eliminates some of those illegal dealers, so now that the government's the only market for it, presumably a 16-year-old won't be able to go buy it off the street.
Sure. It's the difficulties, I think a resale market is likely to crop up, or at least a black market of some description. And so like, it strikes me that all the benefits of that, of having the 16-year-olds involved, sort of either fall into other areas or were quite difficult to demonstrate in this case. Was somebody's...
Yeah, the thing is that when you legalize these type of things, what usually happens is that consumption goes down because you take out the prohibition. That happened with alcohol, that happened with prostitution in Holland, and that happened with drugs in Holland that were legalized.
Okay, so we could use some idea of sort of taking away, everyone calls it forbidden fruit effect. I really don't like that name, but I can't think of a better way of explaining it, which might suggest it's got a good name. So yeah, the idea that by taking away forbidden fruit effect you decrease consumption. I actually find this hugely difficult to explain. Also, I believe it wasn't true for prohibition as well. You may well be right about drugs and prostitution, but for prohibition, I'm reasonably certain alcohol consumption went up after it was taken off. I don't know. You can make this argument, and you can make it in the ways in which I've been explaining. It's not an argument I tend to rely on in this debate because I think there's better argumentative places to go with it. Before we move off this aspect of the arguments, just touch on definitions. I mean, there may be a session on definitions at some stage, I don't actually know. But one of the things that would be quite useful to be able to claim here is that we'd get people into rehab far more effectively. Now, obviously that's a bit of an ancillary benefit that's going to be difficult to demonstrate purely analytically. So why not put it in the model? I think it's going to be reasonably easy for us to say in our definition that we're going to have aggressive treatment clinics where we sell drugs. So at the place where they sell drugs, given that we're having the government sell it, we give people leaflets about treatment, or we can offer them treatment free, or we can twin the place where they sell drugs with the place they're treated for drugs, or something like this. We can get into the mechanism some way in which we're going to be able to force rehabilitation onto people. So we can just have government involvement in the entire process. But even analytically, you can say that if we're legalising all drugs and people are better engaged with the way in which drugs are sold by government, they're more likely to seek out government services because they trust them better. Something like that. But it's far easier if it just goes in the definition. The last thing on health, which I had, which just ties into something which we've already discussed, is seeking treatment for overdoses. It ties into the argument about fear of rehabilitation. Essentially, the same fear of rehab exists to seeking help when you take an overdose. Essentially, a lot of people who overdose are quite scared of going to hospital, or even who just really need to seek help at that stage in their drug-taking experience, because they think that if they go to hospital, they might get caught under the influence of drugs, or the hospital might report them to the police, or they might face some legal consequences in general for their actions. And so people are quite scared to seek treatment, and so often don't, with adverse medical consequences. So that's something we can put in at the end, just to make that far more thorough. Okay, so if you look at this argument as a whole now, we now have 1, 2, 3, and this last one about hospitals. Ooh, is that right? Hospitals. So we now have 4 reasons why this limits health consequences. So we can now start this argument by saying, okay, so I'm going to tell you how this minimises the health consequences of drug taking. I've got 4 reasons. And so then you just fire them through, and like that, you've got a far more rigorous, far more thorough arguments to rely upon. Let's deal with the more interesting one, because health is a bit dull. What do people think about the impacting of the health claims? How do you think you do it? Do you think you need to do much of it? Opinions on health consequences? Do they strike people as so obviously important that we barely need to discuss it, or do people think that we should probably spend some time proving that they matter?
I think it's probably pretty obvious.
It's reasonably obvious, yeah. I think absent a strong challenge about whether or not we should care about other people's health. We should probably, like, most people seem to care about other people being healthy. I find it reasonably plausible that we limit deaths from drug taking. It's quite a good argument. I don't really think we need to impact that claim too significantly beyond demonstrating that it's true. There might be some marginal cases. It might be in a summary speech. If you're weighing things, you might have to demonstrate its importance. But I actually think it's quite tricky as well. Let's move on to crime, because I think this is more interesting and far easier to impact. Okay, so what are the criminal consequences of drug taking?
Lots of people go to jail.
Okay. People go to jail. Let's try to be a little more specific.
You'll owe money to the drug dealers, and they might kill you eventually if you're addicted and, get drugs from them and then don't pay back. Okay, cool. Let's take this idea. So you might owe money to drug dealers. I think this goes in the middle of the argument somewhere. So what are we going to try to prove with this argument? What do you think could happen if you owe money to drug dealers?
Well, if you're buying drugs, you're probably supporting some crime, probably organized crime at some level.
Okay, sure. We'll come back to that. I think just try and separate out this idea of what will happen to an individual if they owe money to a drug dealer. How do you think that's likely to go for somebody?
Not well.
Poorly.
Yeah, poorly. In what way?
Well, it basically endorses the idea that drug dealer is okay, and that's why crime is okay. Because, if I can deal with drug dealer to get drugs, and that's fine with me, then probably it's fine to, do other illegal things. So, with the individual, if you go and do something illegal once, buying drugs from drug dealer, then it's okay to do something illegal for you the second time and the third time.
Okay, sure. I think that's another good idea, but I think it's slightly separate to the first one. If we just look at the idea of debt, so I think it's a reasonably common pattern. I at least believe it's a reasonably common pattern, although obviously I have no personal experience. That if you buy drugs from somebody, you often run out of money, and essentially then will get some for in advance, and you'll promise to pay later, and you're thereby in debt to your drug dealer. You owe money. So what do you think is likely to happen as a result of that indebtedness if he asks you to pay back and you can't?
He will shoot you.
Okay, let's suppose that he has a slightly more long-term outlook on his customer relationships. How do you think he might deal with this?
He'll make you do something that you don't want to pay him back. Some favor.
Nice, okay, so what do you think that's likely to involve?
Prostitution.
Prostitution is probably one example, or if not prostitution, then stealing, drug running, dealing yourself, various things. Okay, So we're going to argue that by buying drugs, what are we trying to argue that these people are ultimately going to do? We're arguing that they're going to go into prostitution or drug running. So essentially this argument is in some way trying to demonstrate that taking drugs or buying drugs from gangs or drug dealers is a gateway to crime. Okay? Is that roughly what we think we're proving? Good, it's roughly what I think we're proving. Okay, so the first idea we had was that we were going to be in debt to somebody and that was likely to coercively lead us to committing crimes. Okay? So, can we see the way in which we're ordering this argument now? Because that's quite important. The idea of debt's a good one. But the idea of debt is a constituent part of this argument, because ultimately the consequence, we think, of going into debt to a drug dealer is either that you'll get shot, or that you'll be coerced, essentially, into some form of criminal activity in order to pay off that debt. Okay, so how else did we say it was a gateway to crime? Your idea was useful. So once we've broken the law once, it weakens the sort of the social norms against breaking the law again. So do people see how that argument works? So generally, the argument works on the premise that the law isn't just, we don't just follow the law because it's written down, we follow the law because there's a social pressure or a governmental pressure to follow the law. But then once we breach that pressure once, it's easier to do so the next time. I think there's a marginal difficulty with this argument, and it's unclear exactly why that's true, and exactly why the same pressures apply to different types of illegal behaviour. I mean, I have occasionally met people who take illegal drugs, but I don't consider them to be more likely to shoot somebody. It's not entirely clear that the social pressures that operate on one area are the same as operate in another area. And so I'm not perfectly certain that this argument is fantastic. But it's probably worth throwing in as part of our structure. So social pressure weakened. We'll come back to make this argument in a slightly different way in a little while. Okay, how else? So let's look at this idea of social pressure in a bit more detail. Let's do it now, actually. How do we know whether or not this is a somewhat high-level discussion, somewhat removed from what we're talking about? How do we generally know whether our actions are moral or immoral? Judith?
Society and societal norms.
Okay, so society and societal norms, but society is very broad, right? And we're not exposed to a huge cross-section of society. I've spent the last sort of 3 weeks only being exposed to debaters, and if morality was determined entirely by what debaters did, I think we'd live in a slightly strange world. So how do we think generally, more specifically, morality is determined? Not just by societies, but well...
Like the group of people you associate with.
Okay, so I think we can probably claim that morality is determined quite locally. I use this example only because it's interesting and not because I'd ever advise you to use it in a debate. It's far too convoluted to get into a debate. They did a psychological test with people where essentially what they do is they get 20 people to go into a room to do like a written psychological test paper thing, which was just a scam that they weren't that interested in. 19 of the people in the room would be psych students. They'd just be people who were involved in the experiment. And one person was the only person who's actually being tested. And so during the test, what they do is they pump smoke under the door of the adjoining room. And so like there was a little bit of smoke just coming into the room under the door. And they then slowly start making it look more and more like there was a fire next door. But the 19 people who knew about the experiment were all told, don't react, do nothing, keep on going with the test, pretend that nothing's going on. To test whether or not the one person would go, isn't there a fire over there? And none of them did, or very few, borderline statistically insignificant number, actually did anything about the fact that there was, or appeared to be a fire going on in the next door. So you can see then that morality, or this was tended to demonstrate that morality was determined by sort of the social surroundings of the person. I think we can probably demonstrate this analytically as well. I think it's very difficult to know what is or isn't immoral. I think we take a lot of our signals from people we know or social disapproval. And so I think we can say, at least reasonably convincingly, that morality is socially determined. And so what are we trying to prove with this? I haven't quite got there yet. So if morality is socially determined, what happens when we buy drugs? Who do you spend a lot of time with?
People that are willing to do illegal things.
Yeah, we'll stay away from value-based claims just yet. But I think certain people who are willing to do illegal things, and specific types of illegal things being taking or selling drugs, or possibly shooting people. You're very interested in shooting people. Have you had a really bad experience with drugs? Okay. So, yeah, you're likely to spend a lot of time with, time around drug taking and drug dealing. So essentially, what then happens to our perception of drug taking and drug dealing?
It changes.
Yeah, how does it change?
Well, it doesn't seem immoral and unacceptable anymore.
Yeah, it doesn't. So what does it seem instead?
Oh.
Normal, absolutely. I think if you spend a large amount of time associating with people who sell and who take drugs, this just becomes something that you consider to be normal. It's very difficult, cognitively, for people to think that large numbers of their friends are all immoral, because then that doesn't work very well with people's perceptions of self. And so it's probably true that if you spend a large amount of time around people who do something that you previously considered immoral, you'll come to see it as normal. So, I can't even read my own writing now. What does that say?
Time, drug taking / dealing.
Time?
That's what it
I
looks like.
don't think it is time.
It's like the time you spend with them.
Yeah, that was
It's like
the
you're
idea.
Okay. Time with drug takers and dealers. I hope nobody's following this too closely. So generally we get the idea that we're spending more and more time with people who take drugs, more and more time with people who deal drugs. So we're more likely to see both the taking and the selling of drugs as something that's morally not that big a deal, not a problem. And so we can then link that back to our point. It's more likely to be a gateway to crime because perhaps you will be asked at some stage to do a bit of dealing or to do a bit of drug running for somebody. And you're then less likely to see that as something that's strange, something that's weird. Is there anything else you want to say about gateways to crime? No, I don't think so. Okay, so let's have a look. How else do you think taking crime can lead to engaging criminal behaviour? We'll touch back on, what was your answer earlier, Mara?
Going about jail.
Yeah, okay, so what happens when we go to jail?
We work around them.
You are with people
Or also,
Yeah, so, I mean, there are obviously harms of people going to jail, but let's try and focus on the drug taking aspect. So you're around criminals, yeah, and we've got the general arguments that I'm sure you've all heard a lot about associating with criminals and learning things from criminals, but you can also tie that back into the time with drug takers and drug dealers and talk about normality.
Well, it also changes the perception of society towards you. So basically, if you've been to jail, then, I mean, no. I don't want to talk to you.
Okay, great. So let's have a think about this argument. Can anyone think of a specific context within which that's true?
Applying for a job.
Absolutely, applying for a job. Okay, so how do people tend to respond to job applicants who have been to prison? Badly, yeah. Okay, so what are we trying to demonstrate with this? What's going to happen to people once they come out of jail for drug-related offences with a criminal record?
they're not going to be able to come back.
Okay, so it's going to be difficult for them to get a job, and therefore...
They're just going to return to crime generally.
Okay, so...
The best option is their buddy who still sells drugs.
Absolutely. Okay, so I think the argument we're trying to get into this is sort of a gateway, but it's not really the gateway, is it? So maybe it entrenches in criminal... Entrenches in a situation. We'll start with... I'm going to be no less specific than situation at this stage. Okay, so we had the idea about inability to get a job. Oh no, it's going to be in a circle now. We had the idea about inability to get a job, and it's then very easy to impact that claim. I think this is quite an important argument, and so it might be worth, because we're going through things that are obviously bad here, right? It's pretty clear to everybody that if it's true that drug taking leads you to committing lots of crime, pretty obviously bad. At this stage, though, I think this deserves its own separate impacting. And so this is one of the ways in which you can do the impacting of a claim to explain why it's important. You can either analyse the whole chunk and at the end say, why is this important? Or, in each individual place, you can justify its importance. So, when we're talking about people entrenched in drug-taking or criminal situations, the inability to get a job then becomes very important. Why do you think that is?
Because a job is necessary for a decent social standing.
Okay, so we've got ideas of social standing. We had ideas that it will sort of push you back towards, sorry, from Julia, that it would push you back towards crime.
It's more difficult for you to integrate back into what was normal to you before you accustomed with all those drug dealers and drug takers. And
Sure, okay.
There's no way back, basically.
Great. So essentially we're left with the idea that this then becomes a long-term situation, right? That you're entrenched in an environment where drug taking or drug selling is one of your only options, where drug taking is something that's socially normal. So you're then entrenched in that situation. And what's the importance of that is it essentially traps people. It's then something that's very difficult to break and something that's very hard to get out of. So the reason this is important is not just because it happens once, but because it leads to incredibly long-term repeats of the harms up here, these harms and the health consequences we were talking about earlier. So it's useful to explain that. So it traps people in cycle. Okay. So what else do you think? What else do you think we can say that's sort of quite trivial about the consequences of crime? I think you sort of touched on it for us earlier.
You should be.
We'll get shot. Let's focus on the getting shot aspect of it. Where do you buy drugs? Yeah, I don't mean specifically here. But scary places is generally reasonably descriptive. I think this is a reasonably simple argument, and I don't think you'd spend a huge amount of time on it, but it's not normally that safe to go and buy drugs in dangerous areas. You engage with dangerous people, and just generally that's probably puts you at risk of crime. I think you can whip through that pretty quickly, just by saying that when you go to buy drugs, dangerous areas, risk of crime. You can probably also say that when you take drugs, you're likely to take drugs in dangerous areas. Typically, people do take drugs in dangerous areas. They don't tend to take it in your local cafe because it's illegal, and they don't tend to take them at home because then there's often social pressure to avoid doing so. So I think it's true that both the purchase and the use of drugs, that people put themselves in dangerous situations, where at risk both of the health consequences earlier and the crime consequences we're touching upon here. Okay, so what I want to get at through this, I think this is probably, roughly where you finish with this argument. As you can see, we've now got a far more rigorously analysed argument than we did when we started. And even to the extent that you go through and pick out some of these aspects, it's very helpful to separate them out like this. I think it's quite clear now why you're saying all these things. At the stage where I'm saying, for example, there'll be less stigma on drug taking, we can explain why we're saying that. Because if you just stood up and said, okay, so there's going to be less stigma on drug taking and that's the thing, then as a judge you're likely to be sitting there going, wait, so more people take, and it's very, very difficult for a judge to understand why you're saying that. But when it comes here as part of the structure, and is linked back to the notion of addiction, it then becomes far clearer why you're saying everything, and it's obviously far more important. Does anyone know how long these last, by the way? Nobody bothered telling me.
It's an hour.
Is it an hour?
Maybe it's a little bit longer.
Maybe a little bit longer. Delightful.
You remember?
I've got another couple of arguments to whip through, and I know the exercises we're doing afterwards. So it might be it's definitely useful to go through one more.
You have 35 minutes left.
Okay, cool. Right, so let's switch to the op of this debate.
Before we move on,
sure.
Would it be the right thing to say that you basically, drive out the black market for drugs and instead of the profits go to government and then they can be spent on, all this good stuff and...
Sure, so, why don't we have a brief discussion in the other areas? So, I think you can argue that, and I think that certainly works as an argument. Does anybody... What do people feel generally about the argument that we raise tax revenue from the sale of drugs?
It is not so important as...
You can just put it in the model.
Yeah, I think it doesn't sound as important. Like, It's quite often that you get teams making arguments about costs, and judges just go, I don't care. It seems to be because quite often in debating we've managed to sort of minimise the impact of money. I know that's slightly unrealistic, but it has sort of spillover effects. There's sort of some sensible reasons for this, because I think a proposition if you spend your time proving why this raises tax revenue, ultimately I don't think that that's a very easy claim to impact. Whereas I do think if you spend time saying how this leads to the better rehabilitation and treatment of people, I think people do care about that. I think it's far easier to engage with. John, Gillian.
I think the point that I was trying to be made was more that you're going to be going and buying it from the like you're going to be buying it from the government rather than from a black market, rather than from criminals. So you'd be buying it kind of be on the other side in a safer location, unless you'd be giving profit to the government rather than like fueling crime.
Then you wouldn't be supporting drug cartels.
Yeah, sure. I think it's certainly of use. I just think there are better ways to spend time in this debate. Like generally, when you have an argument like this, or when you're in first or even second proposition, you have to allocate time in some way, and it's always sensible to pick those arguments that are most easy to impact or that sound the most important. And I think that even when you link this very closely to the funding of drug cartels, I think it's then I still think it sounds more important to limit the health consequences, or at least I think it's something that you can compare more easily with other sides' harms. Although we are going to touch on cost aspects. Mariel, you said that we could put it in the model. How would you put something like that in the model?
I would just say that like we would have obviously tax revenues on this would fund good things like the programs that you were talking about.
Yeah, sure. So if we're introducing a load of new programs which are costly, the other side they probably won't. They might say, how can you afford all that? In which case I think that it's quite handy to have a ready-made answer from the model, where you just go, yeah, well, you've got a tax on them and it's fine. Although, there's one thing to note, it is a little risky in this debate to put a huge tax on drugs, because, what obvious problems does that lead to?
People are going to want to buy very expensive drugs, and then there'll be a bigger black market.
Yeah, it makes the black market argument stronger, because people are more likely to buy cheaper drugs. There's a reasonable black market in the UK on cigarettes, because our tax on cigarettes is like 400 times the European tax on cigarettes. It's not quite that, but it's certainly much larger than the French tax on cigarettes. So you get a lot of sort of illegal cigarette imports, which are less safe. And so there's a reasonable chance that when you massively increase taxes, you also massively increase your black markets. And when your black market's quite large, you lose a lot of benefits we were claiming earlier. So that was one of the ideas we had at the start, the idea of cost. What do you think about this idea about the environment, the environmental effects? Was that you? What? No. This is you, sorry, you of course. How do you think we can impact this?
We talked slightly about how dangerous the environment was.
Okay, so you mean social environment, right?
But particularly, I guess the impact that it has on inner cities, and maybe it would be a good argument to draw the distinction between how this affects upper class communities versus.
Yeah, sure. We can probably use this as a way of impacting one of these claims, can't we? So something like when we're talking about either gateways to crime or even entrenchment in this sort of situation, we can locate this in areas and talk about the ways in which those effects spill over. Yeah, I do think that's a useful thing to make, but I do think it fits quite well into this structure. Also, I'm not saying that, by the way, that I've got every single reason under here. I'm sure that I haven't, and a large part of being a good debater is being able to throw out more reasons. I think that's probably a very strong one, and that's something that we put in there. It just happens to be not one of the ones I prepped last night. Okay, let's move on to the op. I think the op for this debate's harder. I'm afraid I'm going to end up telling you the arguments that we're going to go through in this, because it's the one that I've gone through. And it's a more useful one to think about intellectually. But what do generally people feel about the op to this debate?
More drug use.
More drug use, sure. What's the impact?
It's bad for people's health.
Yeah, okay, so we can run
you
a...
get your hands on it more easily, there's no longer a social norm, so you're more
sure.
stigmatized.
So we can run an argument that more people are going to be using it, it's bad to take drugs generally, and then we can And then we can try and win on that. The difficulty was that there's a lot of the health arguments run into the, but won't it be better if it's legal? And so then that becomes quite a tricky comparative, because you're comparing the amount of extra people who take drugs against the amount to which it's safer to take drugs and trying to clash those two ideas, which are actually quite difficult, I think, analytically to access. And then essentially a judge is likely to just go with the team who did more of the analysis. I think there are ways in which you can look for a more impactful thing, or a possibly more impactful thing. I'm still not entirely sold on the arguments I'm going to use. Any other ideas?
Slower inhibitions generally, like from more, like if more people using drugs, generally the experience of taking drugs includes, you know, a higher willingness to engage in illegal activity and other things. Riskier sexual behavior.
Okay, so we can tie the social stigma argument back into other people's. Like, it's unclear to me how you link that. I mean, very tightly to the debate and to the object of the motion. Because once again, it relies on the same premise that we were discussing just now. I'm going to come back to that premise anyway, but I think once you've got the idea people are taking more drugs, I think the idea that this leads to other forms of risky behaviour is quite a low impact claim. It seems quite marginal. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Anyone want to think about anything else who I haven't spoken about it in the past with? Does that happen?
Yes. You can talk about marketplaces where it hasn't been well regulated in the production standpoint.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about this, because I think this is where we should go with this. Where do we buy drugs from? Where's the world's supply of heroin from? Do people know this? Who's the...
Afghanistan, Colombia.
Yeah, Afghanistan, Colombia. I think most of it's Afghanistan, I think. But like, sure. And then there's the more of it's marijuana and huge. I mean, where's all the US's marijuana come from?
Mexico.
Yeah. So we've got a couple of areas where there is production of drugs that is less well regulated. Okay, so what are we going to say about what's going to happen in these places?
Well, I think if we're making the argument that consumption goes up, then
Yeah.
the profit margin for producing it goes up, which means there's going to be greater violence.
Okay, cool. So ultimately the claim that we're looking at is that this is going to lead to more violence in drug-producing areas. That's the impact, right?
Well, the government is likely to present some sort of plan that basically eliminates the drug-producing areas.
How?
As in, if these drugs are produced, as you said earlier, by a government in the US,
Mhm.
then Mexico will have a capitalist reason.
Okay, so I mean, this is an interesting idea. It's something we're going to have to deal with at some stage. Okay, so let's talk in very general terms. What does the US grow as an agricultural business? Corn. A huge amount of corn. And do you know how it's competitive in corn? Subsidies. Right. Okay. So, what is it about primary industries that can make a country competitive? Probably two things. Well, I mean, there are multiple things, but probably basically.
Production.
Hmm?
You have massive production.
So
the price is lower.
Yeah, okay, so we're looking at low price. What are the components of that low price? I think scale, like, so suitability of area is one. And obviously, a huge amount of the US's advantage in corn came at a time when it could just have these absolute humongous fields that no other country could ever match, because it's quite large. But what is the other aspect of cost that's frequently important to primary and secondary industry?
Labor costs.
Labour costs, okay, cool. And is the US ever going to have any sort of advantage in labour costs compared to Afghanistan?
No.
Like they have a high degree of mechanization, though.
Yeah, so investment's obviously relevant, right? But then there becomes a distinction here as to how much that's important. And I think generally prevailing world economic conditions have demonstrated that typically it's labour. You may not want, it may vary crop by crop. And it may be that in terms of like the specifics of heroin production, we can't quite get into this. But I think it's reasonably likely we can argue that cheaper labour costs are going to mean that at least a significant amount of this is still going to be produced elsewhere. It's also true that the US is reasonably close to its capacity of marijuana production in the states where it's legal. It's quite fun. Washington's basically at capacity for marijuana production already. There's no space to grow it anymore in Washington, where it's just been legalised. Roughly the same in Colorado. Using some spec knowledge here, does anyone else know anything about the conditions in which it's useful to grow marijuana?
Good for the fielder, for the soil.
Yeah, but what conditions does the plant need to grow? Yeah, it needs to be warm. And so, generally, illegal marijuana operations tend to be shut down because they use huge amounts of electricity. One of the easiest way of tracking a marijuana operation is to just look at electricity bills. Because you have to run huge ultraviolet lights, or whatever they call the blue lights. And it's very, very expensive to do so in a sort of in a non-very warm climate. So what we're getting at here is there are likely to be comparative advantages in the production of drugs. These are likely to apply to areas where the climate is suitable and where to a certain extent the economic conditions are prevailing. And one of those economic conditions that's important is likely to be labour use.
Would it be a possibility to leave the opposition case off of the China's history in the 19th century with the opium wars, when basically Chinese government was fighting to illegalize drugs, illegalize opium, and British Empire was basically exporting these huge amounts of opium. So half the population of China was drug addicts. Nothing worked basically. Whole country was just sitting there and smoking the shish.
So,
for 2 centuries.
Yeah. So what do you think that this demonstrates?
This demonstrates that legal drugs lead to abuse of those drugs.
Okay, sure. I think we can make that argument, but I would rather focus on the idea about destabilising countries. I think this is an example of that as well. I just think that Mexico is quite an obvious example.
How about productivity?
About?
Well, as an example, never buy a car that was manufactured on a Wednesday because everybody was hungover. I mean, it's a demonstrated fact.
Really? Why are people hungover on Wednesdays?
Normally what would happen is they would go out drinking on Tuesday because they'd sobered up on Monday.
Right, I see. Okay, so how are we going to link this to drug use? How are we going to link this to the drug discussion?
Productivity.
Okay.
If people are addicted to drugs.
Right, I see.
All right. Absenteeism from work.
Sure. Yeah, so, okay. What I want to do, so I think these two ideas fit into similar categories, right? They all start from the premise that use is going to increase, and then they focus on the way in which that will impact both people's health and society. So let's work on this premise to start with. We're going to come back to ultimately violence in drug-producing areas, because I think this is one of the easiest claims in the world to impact. But let's look at this idea of increased consumption. We've touched on it already, but why do we think people are likely to take more drugs? So we had a few answers about this already.
Because there are a lot of people that would like to try them possibly, but know that it's illegal, so they don't dare to.
Okay, so we've got reduced legal consequences. Okay, anything else?
They're more readily available.
To go to a nice shop than to go to a dodgy street corner.
Yep, availability.
You have a whole new group of users because a lot of people won't use drugs if they have to go to a sketchy place to get them, but now it's just you walk in a shop and buy them.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like, it's also probably true that they'll become far easier to get hold of. If I turn up in some random town and I'm on holiday, so it's probably going to be quite difficult for me to track down the local dealer. It's going to be very easy for me to drop into a convenience store if drugs are sold there, or a government-mandated depository if drugs are sold there. Are stored there, sorry. Okay, something a little more nebulous. Yeah.
What about the social stigma?
Yeah, the social pressure argument. I think it's actually worth spending a little bit of time on the social pressure argument here. So what form can we talk about the social pressure? It ties into what you were saying. If, how many of you think you get away, how many people think at a job you get away with lighting up in your cigarette break? It's pretty unlikely. You can probably get fired pretty sharpish. And so, like, this is one of the ways in which we can understand social pressure. You can see that it may be that drug taking is accepted by you and your friends. But even then, there's still a separate area of your life in which you can see that drug taking is basically forbidden, or there's social pressure against you doing this. I mean, I think even illegal drug takers who think it's fine don't tell their boss about it. And so we can look at the way in which social pressure is actually very broad. So we can say that even if you just operate within a small group of friends, you're likely to have to go into outside society at some stage. And so this social pressure is going to weaken. It might be the stigma your family place on it weaken, and that might be very important to you. So we can explain this social pressure in a variety of ways by looking at the various different areas in society you interact and explaining exactly how that changes things. Okay, one more in why it might increase consumption. What does the government do when it says that something is illegal?
It sends out a signal or something.
Okay, sure. So to a certain extent, when governments do things, they send a signal about it. They send a signal that illegal things are bad. That doesn't necessarily imply that all legal things are good, but it does tend to suggest that if we're willing to ban something, it's adequately harmful such that it should be banned. So what happens when we legalise drugs? Yes, we lose the government signal. Okay? So, we're likely to decrease government signal. Now, I actually don't think that that's quite enough. Generally, signal arguments are quite difficult to make. They're very difficult to make well. And so I think in order to prove that this is something that will actually happen, we're going to need to prove that this signal is actually effective. How can we go about talking about government signalling and how it works? How do people tend to view governments, normally? Authoritative? Cool.
The man.
Hmm?
The man.
Okay, two slightly conflicting answers. I think there's a reasonable split between those two ideas. I think some people see the government as reasonably authoritative, and others see it as imposing, right? And so we're going to have to tease out that distinction to work out the manner in which this signal is distributed, to work out whether in fact the government distances people from itself, because I find that equally plausible. And in fact, if I was going to run a different argument in proposition, I might say that legalising drugs helps people to engage better with the police, because they now don't see the police as some ludicrous imposing force upon them. So, okay, so we've got the idea that in some cases we're going to be decreasing the government signal. Do we have a good example of this? Good example of government signalling? Yeah, I only have one. Barack Obama came out in support of gay marriage last year at some stage, and there was a reasonable uptick after that in the way in which, in its level of support, especially its support amongst minority communities where Obama is particularly popular. And so I think if you use that as an example, you can see the way in which it might be that some people can send some signals in some ways from a government. There are probably other ways in which we can do this. You can possibly argue that some people operate in a way that says that the government is like a moral agent, and that taking that signal away from those people might be especially problematic. But I think that's the only example I can really come up with. I'm sure that if you keep your eyes on the newspapers, another one will crop up sooner or later. Okay, so I think generally we've tracked down this premise. Okay, so before we move on from this premise, we were going to be pushing this towards the violence and drug-producing areas, but there are other areas that we can use this premise, right? So some of the other things we were talking about, some of your ideas about health costs, and some of the ways in which we're looking to impact some of our other claims dependent upon this premise. So it might be that within the structure of this argument we can move this outside. So we might want to first demonstrate that it's going to increase consumption. This is something we'd probably do, especially if we're in first op, right? If we're in first op to this debate, we're probably going to have various different impacts of the increase in consumption, especially if we're thinking on our feet and we've got all our analysis ready. So it might be that this is something you want to take out of here because it's a common premise and it's something that you rely on very heavily. Also, given that all of our harms rely on increased consumption, you probably want to spend quite a lot of time on it. You really want to make sure that this analysis was very rigorous. I'm doing a rebuttal elective this afternoon, and I will be telling you in that you attack an argument at its weakest point, or at its causatively weakest point. If everything depends on this, if this gets cut away from you, you're going to lose all your consequences because it depends upon this. And so it's worth really making sure that this is as rigorous as possible. This is the argument that needs to be plausible. It has to be plausible, because otherwise you're really going to lose out in the rest of the area. So probably separate this out. It's right at the start to get to increase consumption. So now we move on to the impacts of this, violence in drug-producing areas. So let's move on to look at some of the ways in which that operates.
In Afghanistan, a lot of terrorism is fueled by the poppy production.
Okay, cool. So there may be some funding of crime to start with. But let's try to make this as broad as possible, right? We really want to impact this claim and make it really sound quite significant in these areas. So what can we say about the way in which both Afghanistan and Mexico work as regards drug production, or factors of drug production?
Well, illegal, organizations that operate underground are going to be the ones that are responsible for producing it, because the ones currently buying it are buying it underground. But if you drive the consumer above ground, then you would also allow the producer to do the same.
Sounds like a prop argument to me.
Ah, yeah.
Go on.
Well, I think drug production is generally pretty easy, but if you're a drug producer, necessarily you want monopoly over production in the area, because that allows you to dictate price.
Yeah.
But the problem then is that the only way to create monopoly is to eliminate your competitor, and you can't do that through production because it's easy. So you do it by people. Yes.
Yeah. Finally we're there. That was very satisfying, wasn't it? Okay, great. So I think it's true that people are going to tend towards monopoly, and there's always going to be competition in the market, right? And the entire idea of a drug cartel war is an aim to set up a monopoly. And so when we're looking for monopoly, I think you've got basically all the components of it. You want a monopoly so that you can dictate price, and the ways in which you need to get monopoly are cartelization, essentially. Okay, great. And so we've got some way in which that's likely to lead to some form of violence, at least between cartels. Okay, so how can we impact this claim broader? We've got it pretty clearly that now people are going to be shooting people who try and start up rival drug production, and that we're likely to get monopoly control in some way after a bloody cartel war. That sounds quite good, right? This sounds like a kind of serious argument. So how can we make this even broader?
Well, you can throw in an example, like the FARC guerrillas in Colombia.
Sure.
That literally, because they're trying to take over Colombia, but are reliant on drug profits, significant amounts of violence occurs when one of two things happen. Either when rival producers encroach on their area of production, or when government tries to shut down their production.
Great, okay, so let's take that next aspect of it, government. So obviously when we're talking about cartel wars, we've got two distinct groups, but mostly people who are in cartels. But what happens next is that you get involved in governments. I think Colombia is one good example, Mexico is another pretty clear example that you can use reasonably easy for this. So what happens then when you get some form of government involvement is you get a spillover of that conflict into cartels and governments. So what does that then give cartels an incentive to do?
Move.
Does it?
Well, in the Colombia example, 60% of the production moved to Bolivia.
Okay, let's get. I'm afraid I know less about Colombia than I do about Mexico. What did they do as a response to government's crackdowns in Mexico? Yeah, okay, so various things. They shot them, yeah, so we get direct conflict with government, but yes, perhaps more interestingly, they buy them off, so we get significant levels of corruption. So what form does that corruption take? It isn't just bribes, right? How do you mean extortion?
You know, in terms of public officials, like threatening people's families, so that they just crack down on the cartel.
Okay, sure. So we get government involvement and we get illegal tactics for dealing with that government involvement. And some of those involve threats and trying to influence government ministers. But what's a more direct way of doing it than influencing a government minister?
Kidnap each other.
Sure, okay, so you get this sort of broader influence and scarier influence, but it's also true that it often leads to large numbers of people becoming government ministers who are from drug cartels, or becoming police officers who are from drug cartels. One of the most significant problems in Mexico tackling drug gangs is that the drug gangs are basically the police and the army and the government. And so that becomes very difficult. But can you see how that makes that claim far broader? We don't just have the argument that you're going to have a war between cartels, which sounds bad, but like limited, or even that you're going to have a war between the Mexican army and cartels. But at its very highest, that you now have cartels who are the government and who are now dictating government policy along cartels' best interests. You see how that makes it broader? We move to exercise, Gina. Okay, cool. Do you have one last comment on that?
Yeah, no, I have just a question. How is this whole production argument a off point?
Because
I feel it's a stronger point on the government.
The reason it's an odd point is because you then tie it back into the thing that we spoke about but haven't got around to writing just yet. When you tie it back into the production is going to continue to come from these areas, because you've got pre-established supply chains, then you can say that because there's an increased consumption and an increased demand along the supply chain, you're going to get an increased destabilisation of the areas, and these consequences are going to be likely. So that was why we discussed methods of production and why these areas have comparative advantages in them. Okay, let's do some exercises.